Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Elizabeth Kahn. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Education Director at Mazzoni Center. I am very honored to introduce Brian Taylor to you. They are the CLEAR Coordinator at Mazzoni Center in the Prevention Department, and this is one of the collaborations that we are doing between departments, so we're very excited to bring it to you today. Brian, would you introduce a little bit more about yourself and tell us what your mindset was behind creating this webinar?
Absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Glad to be here and really happy to do this collab. I think what we're providing is super important. As Elizabeth said, my name is Brian, pronouns they, them. I'm the CLEAR Coordinator and Wellness Counselor for Mazzoni. I work with clients who are living with HIV, and we do basically short-term life skills building and wellness counseling. So my thought process behind this webinar was we are in an extreme situation, global pandemic. We're currently going through a situation of quarantine and social distancing measurements. And this is a very novel experience for, I would imagine, a vast majority of us. And I wanted to be able to provide something that would help us as we navigate this experience. What I wanted to do was, rather than only provide examples of things that someone can do, my idea was to sort of go a little deeper into why we are feeling the way that we are, why we are reacting in the way that we are, and how understanding those things about ourselves can help with coping in the meantime.
I put a great framework on it. Thank you. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have.
Thanks. Real quick disclaimer. The focus of this presentation is on managing personal stress and maintaining mental well-being on an individual level. So the intent is not to tell you what to do, but rather to offer some insight and coping strategies. If anyone listening to this is in crisis or at risk from an unsafe living environment, please refer to the resources provided here. Topics are anything from suicidal ideation to domestic violence to unemployment. We're going to get into things that are how to cope with varying degrees of stress. However, there are still situations such as these which are not the responsibility of the individual to try and fix. And so I want to ensure that these sources are also provided in those situations. Thank you. So, just so we're all on the same page, though I'm sure we are, current social distance guidelines as dictated to us here in Philadelphia and PA and in general are to stay at home as much as we can, to avoid public spaces. When we do go outside, to maintain a distance of at least 6 feet in between individuals. Also, if possible, to wear a mask that covers the mouth and the nose. Please, we are encouraged not to attend or host large gatherings. And also, we are encouraged to avoid using mass transit when possible. But suffice it to say, this situation, this pandemic, qualifies as a traumatic experience, hands down. It's characterized by prolonged stress, ever-present vigilance, exhaustion, and uncertainty. The impact that these ongoing characteristics can have on our mental health and well-being cannot be understated. And that's sort of the driving forces for what I wanted to provide here today.
Brian, how does this impact those living with HIV?
So when it comes to HIV and COVID-19, there are a couple things to be mindful of. Anyone living with HIV is at an increased risk from COVID-19 only if their CD4 count, white blood cell count, is particularly low and or they're not on treatment. Anyone maintaining an undetectable status, according to the CDC, is at no more risk than someone who is HIV negative. Now, this is as far as we know. And granted, we still want to err on the side of caution. So with that in mind, the CDC has offered some recommendations that anyone living with HIV take certain precautions. These are to ensure an ample supply of medication, ideally 30 days if that's possible for you. Also, if possible, to set up telehealth or online portal options for medical needs and medication refills. Trying to be sure that your vaccinations are up to date, particularly for flu and pneumonia. Those are incredibly relevant right now with COVID specifically. And also, if possible, maintaining a social network remotely, but still good, because mental and social health are just as important as the physical health.
And Brian, you were speaking about trauma and trauma responses. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on those responses.
Yeah, for sure. So trauma is a response to a deeply distressing or disturbing event, overwhelming an individual's ability to cope. That absolutely qualifies what we are currently experiencing. Such events often involve loss of control, abuse of power, feelings of helplessness, pain, confusion, and or loss. All things that people have experienced within the past couple months. Acute stress is the resulting feelings of helplessness, including a diminished sense of self, anxiety, depression, and or feelings of numbness. If any of these sort of sound familiar to anyone listening at home, you may be experiencing prolonged acute stress. So some physical signs that you may be undergoing acute stress include anything from nausea, dizziness, maybe your sleep patterns are different or your appetite is different. And that could be loss of appetite or increased appetite. Headaches for seemingly no reason, muscle tension, sweating, heart rate increasing, really generic things that could honestly easily be attributed to anything. But if you are experiencing them consistently day by day, it may be worth considering that this is an acute stress situation. Some further signs that are moving beyond the physical are feelings of restlessness, insomnia, nightmares in particular, which according to the internet has been actually really common lately. A lot of people experiencing different nightmares. Even things like emotional outbursts, maybe you feel more irritable than usual. Relational problems, difficulty focusing. Maybe it's hard to even do very simple tasks during the day. That can be a sign of acute stress. Feeling unmotivated. The experience, basically, I've listed a lot of things here, not to overwhelm people with information, but to basically point out how these experiences are going to vary from person to person, which is why we typically define trauma and acute stress more by the response a person has rather than the inciting incident itself. Response often relates to a person's approach to adversity, and we commonly categorize them according to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn.
Would you mind elaborating on the fight, flight, freeze, and fawn?
Absolutely. So, these are, in general, the four main ways in which a person responds to a high stress situation. Fight and flight are pretty common, or were more well known. Freeze and fawn, not as much. We'll cover all four of them just to be on the safe side. So starting with fight, it's when we're in danger, but we believe we can overpower the threat. Our body sends messages to our body to quickly prepare us for the physical demands of a fight. And this is actually something that is going to keep coming up throughout this presentation. This is a lot of what we're talking about is about the relation between the mind and the body and how there is interplay that goes both ways. So when preparing for fight, our behavior may manifest in any number of ways, such as crying unexpectedly, clenching, clenching our jaw, feelings of intense anger, speaking in angry tones. Also didn't mention this on here, but posting angry articles online and that sort of thing, all fight responses and all 100% valid responses to this situation. Contrast to the flight response, this is when we believe we can overcome the danger by running away. Our brain prepares the body for flight. This can look like anything from restless feeling in our legs to numbness in our extremities, maybe constantly moving or feeling fidgety, feeling tense, feeling trapped, especially considering that because we're told to stay in our homes, there really isn't a way to flee per se. And so this one in particular can become very frustrating for people. Another response is the freeze response. This is when running nor fighting is the best choice. Sometimes we freeze instead. This is more characterized by feelings of numbness, feeling cold, maybe feeling stiff or heavy, or detached or empty, difficulties doing, the basic tasks, even like struggling to get out of bed, struggling to brush your teeth, those sorts of things. Those would all be, under the freeze option. It's, like I said, these seemingly innocuous, things that we go with, we've been experiencing on the day-to-day lately are indications of acute stress. Finally, there's Fawn, which is a bit more particular than the other three, but still a valid response option. So I just wanted to include it in case people find themselves experiencing this. Typically, the Fawn response, it comes from a relation to abuse. It's basically feeling like your only hope of survival might be compliance or helpfulness. For instance, we can recognize that if we notice that no matter how poorly someone treats us, we are more concerned about making them happy than doing what is right for us, that would be categorized as a Fawn response. Yeah, and those are the 4 responses. Additionally, in addition to each of these specific responses, what people may also be experiencing is actually a cycling through all of these responses. And that's really one of the huge takeaways of living in this, in this time of social distancing and pandemic, is that we're not necessarily going to experience one response and act accordingly. If you're waking up and you're stressed and your body, triggers you into a fight response, but you cannot adequately satisfy those feelings, your body may shift into a flight response or a Fawn response or a freeze response. And each time that those feelings aren't satisfied, your body might cycle into a different one. And this can happen over and over and over again, which, if it sounds exhausting, it absolutely is. And I think why I wanted to include, really set this point home was because if I've heard, between clients and friends and family talking about how they don't, I just don't get it. I feel so exhausted every day and yet I'm not doing anything. We all are. We're actually doing a lot. It's that labor isn't necessarily physical labor, it's mental labor. And while we don't think of it as labor, it is absolutely taking up a vast amount of our energy and our focus. So if you're feeling exhausted throughout this time, you are doing so much work and you may not even be aware of it, which I think is important to understand.
Ryan, can you speak on how previous traumas can be compounded by this situation?
Oh, I mean, this whole situation is absolutely something we're all experiencing together. And so everyone that is going through this pandemic is susceptible to trauma response and acute stress. However, this can be even further exacerbated for people who have previous trauma and are still working through that. The intensity of the feelings, the intensity of the impact can be significantly greater for anyone who has previous traumas, is experiencing trauma, because the feelings will be related. And so experiencing the trauma from the pandemic can, in and of itself, raise up the other feelings from previous situations, which is why I wanted to try and provide some strategies and some instances of how to, if not solve the issue, at least help with the coping process.
So, what are some of those practices?
So the first one I wanted to get into was the body scan, which is essentially like a non-judgmental, focused awareness of the body. And it sounds straightforward, and it kind of is, but it's also kind of abstract. So we'll get into it. So basically, the way the body scan works is you begin by sitting or lying in a comfortable position and focusing on your breathing, slow and steady. The idea of the scan is to guide your attention through the various regions of the body, starting with the feet and moving your way up, piece by piece. You take the time to give attention to each part of yourself and any accompanying feelings or sensations. So when first starting the practice, we may be confronted with thoughts about success, failure, pleasure, discomfort, etc. Accompanying sensations may relate to sleepiness, physical discomfort, distractions, or feelings of unease. That's okay. The point of this practice is to not to necessarily assess or judge any of those things. The point is to be aware of them as they rise and as they fall, as they come and as they go. The experiences themselves actually can be used as teaching moments, drawing our attention to the thoughts and feelings. Please feel free to acknowledge them and their presence, accept them, and then shift the focus back to the breathing. The main point of the exercise is to keep the focus on the breath and to keep the focus on whatever part of the body you are currently focused on. And I'll provide an example in a few slides, so that this sounds less abstract and more concrete. But yeah, the idea is to maintain the focus on the body, maintain the focus on the breathing, and allow the mind to do as it does, which can be more difficult than it sounds. You don't need to try and suppress or deny any negative thought or feeling or behavior. The goal is to cultivate a more intimate awareness of emotional, cognitive, and physical experience. The underlying point of the body scan is to become more aware of the interplay between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors. Three distinct things that all interact with each other in ways that we might not necessarily be aware of. And that's really the underlying goal of the body scan, is to raise awareness of, oh, this feeling that I have is making me think these certain things. Like, these are the thoughts that I have attached to this feeling, or this discomfort I have in my leg is annoying. I'm feeling annoyed. And now I'm taking that irritability and carrying it with me into other situations, that sort of thing. So once attention is stably focused on bodily processes such as physical sensations or the flow of breath, we can begin to notice the transitory nature of experience, as well as the mind's tendency to judge each sensation, kind of like what we were just talking about. Experiencing periods of uninterrupted sensory awareness can highlight the extent to which the mind engages in automatic evaluative thought. We often have judgments without even being aware that we're making judgments. And it's not to criticize the judgment one way or the other. It's only to, again, raise the awareness of recognizing that judgment when it's happening for what it is, basically. So having noticed the mind's tendency to judge, once we're able to do that, we can in turn notice the attachment to or rejection of the specific body sensations, increasingly aware of the mind as the sort of intermediary between the physical discomfort and the mental, emotional stuff that goes along with it. The goal here is basically to separate your immediate present moment from the stories or opinions about the experience. It's to put yourself wholly present in the singular moment and kind of distancing in a non-attachment way any of the stress and anxieties and feelings that are currently also being experienced. In understanding this distinction, we can cultivate the ability to be flexible and to maintain perspective as we perceive our inner experience and the world around us. Through experiencing the automaticity of judgmental and narrative thinking, we come to understand the impermanence of thoughts and the flexibility of our attention.
Do you have any advice for those that might be new to this practice?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, here is a link to a guided body scan. It's a little long, which is why I didn't provide one, why I didn't do it myself in this presentation. When you don't, okay, so me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of guided meditation. However, it can be super useful for people who are into that sort of thing. Also super useful for anyone who doesn't necessarily know what the body scan, how it's supposed to go, basically. So I wanted to provide a full guided free body scan example that you can put it on, play in the background, and follow along. I do have some helpful tips. One, that the underlying point of the body scan is that the mind actually struggles to give attention to more than one thing. So when we're feeling stressed, focusing on our breathing helps to pull the mind out of that depressed thinking or anxious ruminating and sort of stop that cyclical nature of that thought process. Also too, when practicing the body scan, it can be helpful to do diaphragmic breathing. So breathing from, or AKA belly breathing, would be the ideal method. This is not just because it's a woo-woo and that's how, we all like to say, deep breaths. The reason for deep breathing is actually physiological. When we breathe with our diaphragm, it actually stimulates a nerve cluster that's right underneath our sternum, right here. And that nerve cluster actually activates what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. And the sole function of that system is to calm the body. So the reason deep breathing works is because it's actually triggering a whole system built into our bodies to calm us down. Also, for anyone beginning the practice, I would encourage you to try practicing it routinely, regardless of emotional state. That's kind of like one of the key components, because in becoming familiar with the practice in times of ease, we can better use it in times of stress. So for example, I know for me, when I am experiencing high levels of stress and anxiety, oftentimes if I were to do a body scan in real time, I would notice how my chest usually feels tight. My throat might feel dry. Sometimes my palms will get sweaty. My thoughts will be racing. My heart will beat really fast. And that's what the body scan asks of us, is to, when I'm experiencing stress, take a pause, if able to. Notice the things that are happening in me. Notice what is causing that, and being able to observe it without feeding into it. And like I said, it's the way I'm describing it, I'm sure it sounds relatively straightforward, and it is, but that also doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be something to readily pick up. And that's not to be discouraging. It's more along the lines of, like, if it doesn't feel like it's working well in the beginning, that's totally okay. I would encourage to continue trying, because it's a gradual process. It's more of like learning a new skill set rather than doing a new task. So think more of like riding a bike or something like that. Like, when I first started riding a bike, I used to fall on my butt all the time. Could not do it. Eventually, I got better and better at it, and now riding a bike is like second nature. The body scan is kind of like a similar thing. It can feel awkward. It can feel pointless, frustrating, that sort of thing. And in actuality, that's completely okay. What the body scan encourages us to do is to acknowledge those feelings and recognize them and understand where they're coming from.
If this doesn't necessarily resonate with folks, is there any other anything else that might help with navigating acute stress?
For sure. So the other main one that I included here was the practice of radical acceptance. This, ironically enough, can also go hand in hand with the body scan, but it has merit and stands up on its own too. So radical acceptance is more of a perspective than a practice. It's about accepting life on life's terms and not resisting what we cannot or choose not to change. Accepting reality is difficult when life is painful. No one wants to experience pain, disappointment, sadness, or loss. But those experiences are a part of life. Sometimes we behave as if we believe not accepting something will change the situation. Other times we simply just don't want to feel the pain. There are many life situations that are painful and not in our control. We can't avoid that pain. But what we can control is how much we suffer over that experience. Suffering is the part we can control. And that's sort of what radical acceptance is meant to tackle, or address, I should say. So when we're talking about acceptance, what we're meaning is we're turning resistant ruminating into accepting thoughts. So for example, I'm in this situation. I don't approve of it. I don't think it's okay. But it is what it is, and I can't change that it happened. Radical acceptance is about acknowledging reality, not about liking it or contesting it. Once we acknowledge what's really happened, then we can go on to change it or start to heal. So, and this is like one of the key points too, because I want to make sure this is understood. Radical acceptance has nothing to do with being passive or giving up. It is not akin to approving of the situation or being compliant with it. It's rather about channeling your energy into moving forward. It does not mean giving up. Rather, once we accept reality, we can consider if we'd like to change it. So for example, okay, this pandemic exists. This is happening or happened. So how do I want to handle it? That is the component of radical acceptance. It's not about, well, it is what it is, so I might as well get used to it. No, you don't need to get used to it. That's the choice that you get to make. It's about not challenging. It's about there being no point in challenging the reality of the situation, because we cannot affect that. So let's focus instead on what we can affect.
What makes this practice useful?
Well, so with radical acceptance, really what it's about is that when we attempt to avoid or resist those negative feelings, we actually add suffering to our pain. So we risk feeding by actually avoiding or resisting our feelings about this negative situation. We actually risk intensifying those feelings, intensifying those anxious thoughts and depressed thoughts, and ironically creating more misery through our attempt to avoid the painful emotions in the first place. Avoidance of emotions often leads to depression and anxiety. It can also lead to other destructive behaviors as well. And while these behaviors may help avoid the pain in the short run, they can ultimately make the situation worse in the long run. But we can stop suffering by practicing acceptance. When practicing acceptance, we're still disappointed, we're still sad, perhaps, fearful. What we're not doing is adding to the pain. We're not going to add to the pain by refusing the reality of the situation, because that's just going to exacerbate the emotions. Consequently, in not adding to the pain, we actually end up spending less time thinking about the painful situation. But even when those thoughts do arise, you may find that they trigger less emotional reactivity. With acceptance, suffering dissipates. The pain doesn't disappear, though it may over time. But because you aren't suffering, the pain becomes more bearable, if that makes sense. So, practicing acceptance in these sorts of situations, such as this, helps us prepare for more difficult circumstances and actually leads the way to problem solving. If we don't like something, you first have to accept it, that it is the way it is, before you can try to change it. If you're not accepting something, you'll be so busy fighting that reality that you don't have the energy to put towards trying to change it. And that's really the underlying thing of why I wanted to include this one in the presentation, is because if we're going to try and focus our energies on how to cope and how to navigate this, then shaking our fists at the sky is not necessarily going to help in this particular instance. If it does, cool. If that's what helps you to process your feelings, shake your fist at the sky. That's awesome. What I want to sort of make sure is that how you're responding to it is a decision that you are consciously making. We're trying to take out the reactive component of it and put you back in control. That's really what these underlying strategies that I provided are. It's about regaining a sense of control over our bodies, over our feelings, and over our minds. And because that's ultimately what a lot of this comes down to, is the experience of trauma, the ongoing acute stress is a loss of control. And we're not able to regain as much control as we would like yet. So I wanted to hopefully provide some examples of how we can at least get some control back.
Do you have any advice for those that are new to this practice too?
For sure. So life gives us a lot of opportunities to practice radical acceptance. If there's a problem that can be solved, that's the first option. If it can't be solved, but we can change our perception of it, then that could be the next option. If neither of those options are doable, then consider practicing radical acceptance. So that's the other thing too. I don't want to encourage anyone accepting a bad situation because that's what, seems to be what radical acceptance is. No. It's not about accepting negative situations. It's about recognizing them and then figuring out how you want to respond to it. And we do this by, once again, focusing on the breath, noticing thoughts that we have, such as the situation isn't fair, or we can't stand what happened. letting those thoughts pass, choosing instead an accepting frame, such as it is what it is. Also, a big component of these things is that it's going to take repetition. These are new. Well, I mean, it'll vary from person to person, but generally speaking, these aren't necessarily coping strategies that we're always familiar with, and so repetition is sometimes the best way in which to ensure that we begin to internalize the lessons. And it can be that straightforward, doing it over and over and over again. Yeah. And just some last little closing thoughts. Like I said, like any new skill, these are going to take time to learn. And frankly, I want to encourage everyone to be compassionate with themselves if they are if they feel like these might be helpful to them. Because ideally, these tools provided would be honed in times of rest to then later be utilized in times of stress. So from a therapeutic perspective, these would be strategies that we would go over in session, in that safe environment, in that safe space, to then be applied out in the stressful world. And so by, learning how to use them in the safer environment, we then get a more solid feel for it and then can then apply it in times of stress. Unfortunately, we are already in the times of stress. And so I only bring that up to try and remind people that it is all right if it doesn't seem to be working. And it is all right if it seems frustrating, because you are already going through a lot and it will take time. And while those feelings of frustration and whatnot are valid, please practice compassion with yourself and forgiveness with yourself. You're going through a lot, and I hope you recognize that. We all are. And then I've just provided some references at the end for further reading and or examples. Yep.
Brian, if anyone wanted to reach out to you, would they be able to?
Yeah. So I can be contacted. Well, we're currently working remotely, so I guess the best way to reach out to me would be through email. My email is btaylor@mazzonicenter.org. So that's B as in boy, TAYLOR @Mazzoni Center, MAZZONICENTER.org. Or I also am using a Vonage account for counseling. And my number for that is 267-817-8402, extension 390.
Brian, thank you so much. This was incredibly informative. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. I hope that this was informational for you. Reach out to us if you need anything, and there will be additional resources in the link below. Take care.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Elizabeth. Much appreciated.